Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to talk about Boris Johnson's latest plan for somehow getting out of the Benn Act, which would compel him to seek an extension. But first, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. So Boris Johnson wants to use the Civil Contingencies Act in order to suspend all laws, and be dictator for a time. He thinks this will allow him to ignore the Benn Act when the time comes. Now, I have already covered this on this channel, and he hasn't a hope. In addition, senior lawyers have also said that it's hopeless, and the Good Law Project, which is the group involving Jolyon Maugham, who was the QC who won the case against prorogation in Scotland's Inner House of the Court of Session, has proceedings underway, and he started those a little while ago, a few weeks ago, in Scotland to ensure that Boris Johnson will have to comply with the Benn Act, even under, in his words, pain of imprisonment. So back to the Civil Contingencies Act, and it is indeed an act for emergency powers, but the first section is really clear about what constitutes an emergency. He may be thinking that even though his prorogation ultimately failed, well, it did actually succeed to an extent. It succeeded in shutting down Parliament for over 2 weeks before it was all sorted by the courts. He may imagine that he can just go to the Queen to have her declare this emergency, and he will have circumvented the Benn Act and taken us out of the EU before the courts have sorted it all out. It's also a process that doesn't exclude Parliament, however. Indeed, Parliament has to vote on it within a matter of days. Within 7 days, in fact, Parliament has to have a vote, otherwise the whole thing lapses. So that's the maximum he could possibly get, if he could even get that. Of course, if the plan is to invoke it on October the 18th, 1 day before the Benn Act comes into play, then he might imagine that bringing it before Parliament towards the end of the following week would do enough damage that he'll have run down the clock enough to get away with it. But this isn't true. Now, I'm going to remind everyone that I am not a legal or constitutional expert, more from them in a moment. And yes, we've already got now that the Queen generally has no discretion over a lot of things, with certain prerogative powers that the Prime Minister has. Prime Minister says do a thing, Queen has to do a thing. But listen to this from the Act itself. This is a direct quote. Her Majesty may, by ordering Council, make emergency regulations if satisfied that the conditions in section 21 are satisfied. So it seems that in this case, it's not simply that she complies with this order in council. She does actually get some say. She personally has to be satisfied that the conditions are met. Now, I'm going to suggest that given that there's no way the conditions could be met, this will be a blatant case of the Prime Minister asking to be dictator for a week. There's no way the Queen could be satisfied that the conditions are met, and so she'd actually be duty bound to actually say, sorry, Prime Minister, no. Besides, I'm sure she's none too happy about the last time she was used by Johnson and embarrassed by the entire episode. But that's a common sense look at it. What do the people who are experts in constitutional law say? Fairly consistent, fairly obvious. They point out that there is no scope for the Prime Minister to judge that certain conditions have met. The conditions are extremely tight and clear. They're not open to vague interpretation. There are 3 conditions which must be met, and they must all be met. 1, an emergency has to occur or be about to occur. Now, the only emergency that's even on the horizon is a no-deal Brexit. So that won't wash because he wants to do it for that purpose. Without declaring this emergency, the no-deal Brexit won't be an emergency because it won't happen. 2, it must be necessary to make provision to prevent, control or mitigate that emergency. And 3, the need for the provision must be urgent. So he'd have to state what the emergency is. What's that going to be? And also, it's not going to be believed if he's talking about it now. And remember, the reason this isn't the first time I've done it on this channel is because it's not the first time it's been mooted. Would sort of suggest he won't be genuine, because how can you predict an emergency that far ahead anyway? Also, how would he intend to prevent, control or mitigate the emergency that he's claiming exists? And how does he explain that it requires urgent action? This isn't like in America, where Donald Trump got to claim that on his southern border there was an emergency. There is, what the legal experts are saying is, there is no scope for your own personal interpretation on this. It's a strict legal definition. So yeah, what is he going to say is the emergency? Well, Parliament's been mean to me, won't do what I want. Don't think that really cuts it, do you? He'll have literally nothing to meet any of these conditions, let alone all three. It's a dead strategy that will only seek to make him look more foolish, or maybe in the meantime more bullish. Literally every legal expert has said that the idea is ridiculous, and not ridiculous in the sense that a court would quash it. Because again, the court quashed the idea of prorogation, but not for 2.5 weeks. It's ridiculous in the sense that he'd never get the palace to sign the order. So Boris Johnson will be subject to the Benn Act when the time comes, October the 19th, unless Parliament attempt to hasten the situation, which they've already talked about. Legal experts have already made clear that there are no loopholes in the Benn Act unless Parliament vote for a deal. So I've already discussed this in the past as well. If Parliament votes for a deal, but then the government don't allow a vote on the necessary what are called further obligations, then actually we still crash out the EU without a deal, and he won't be bound by the Benn Act. To much confusion in the country, because if Parliament votes for a deal, you think that's it. But no, that's not it. That's not the only legal requirement required for the deal. There's a load of other things Parliament would have to enact. They have to enact legislation, and that won't happen if the government doesn't bring that legislation before the House in time. But that won't happen because Parliament won't vote for the deal. Even if Johnson brought the withdrawal agreement before the House, not only would they all know about the ploy, but his behaviour has been so obnoxious and unrepentant that there's no way he'd get the votes for it. Even those who want a deal will know that what they'll actually be voting for is a no deal. So the Benn Act will be watertight for all practical purposes, and the plan is to have a court order already in advance should he decide to test the law, as he describes it. Because, as I said before, Jolly and Moan, a few weeks ago began proceedings at the Court of Session again in Scotland to make sure that when the time comes they've already got that court order to wallop him with. No reactive court cases in this scenario. They're ready to go, or they will be ready to go. So all the legal expertise has this to say on the matter. 1. Boris Johnson cannot suspend the law. 2. As long as Parliament do not vote through a deal, Johnson will be compelled to comply fully with the Benn Act. 3. This nonsense about writing a second letter would itself be a breach of the law. That would be as much of a breach of the law as not signing the first letter in the first place. It's a complete non-starter. 4. Boris Johnson will have to seek that extension, complying with what he has been calling the surrender bill. Hopefully, that phrase will bite him on the arse when he has to sign it. So that's the legal certainty out of the way. So now for the political commentary again. That would basically mean Boris Johnson has been properly defeated. He will have signed it even though he said he'd rather die in a ditch. It will transpire that he would rather not die in a ditch or even go to jail. He will not have taken us out of the EU on October the 31st. In fact, there's a good chance we will end up with as much as a 2-year extension. France seems to be in favour of that at the moment. His entire political strategy has been attacking his right flank to destroy Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party. In that, if he hasn't taken us out of the EU and he has had to himself sign this bill, the letter, according to the bill, then he will fail that spectacularly. The Brexit Party will be merciless with him. Whilst he's been focusing on his right flank, the Lib Dems are plundering his left flank in the centre-right. Sure, he will retain some just out of habit because they vote Conservative, and others that actually want to leave the EU. But right-wing Remainers are lost to him. So in a general election, which will follow his humiliation, and fairly quickly you'd imagine, he'll lose votes on his right to the Brexit Party, votes on his left to the Liberal Democrats. The Brexit Party and the Conservatives are likely to cost each other quite a lot of seats. This could well end up with a very interesting, albeit very hung Parliament after such an election. But it could also mean a very clear majority of anti-no deal parties that will work together to at least go for another public vote. Without a majority, the Lib Dems will have to accept that they have no mandate to simply revoke Article 50. And similarly, without a majority, Labour can't negotiate another agreement even if they form a government. I mean, in theory they could send ministers off to do it, but I'm sure that the SNP and the Lib Dems would insist on going straight for a public vote if Labour want their help in getting literally any legislation through Parliament at all. All happy and glorious. At least that's what may happen politically. But the legal situation is utterly clear. There is no dissension in the ranks. Boris Johnson is buggered. He's been buggered for a while. He just doesn't know it yet. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.